What is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on ex-World War II era German artillery and infantry weapon systems that were used by the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War of 1963 through 1975, also known as the Second Indochina War. Now, during the Vietnam War, a number of World War II vintage German weapons were supplied to both North Vietnam and South Vietnam by both the Soviet Union and the United States. These included infantry weapons like rifles, submachine guns, and machine guns, and also artillery systems like field artillery, anti-tank guns, and some anti-aircraft guns from the Second World War that were refurbished by both the Soviet Union and supplied to both North Vietnam and the South Vietnamese armed forces. Now, first we're going to start off with infantry weapons, as those are the smallest on the list. And the first infantry weapon on the list to appear in the Vietnam War was the German MP40, or the Maschinenpistolen 40. And this was a German submachine gun designed in the late 1930s and was the standard German submachine gun of the Second World War. The weapon was chambered for the 9x19mm Parabellum and was fed by a 32-round box magazine and had a rate of fire of between 450 and 500 rounds per minute. During World War II, both the Soviet Union and United States and the U.S. forces managed to capture hundreds of thousands of MP40s from the defeated German Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions. Later on, during the Indochina War, many of these MP40s ended up in the hands of the French army during the First Indochina War of 1946 through 1954 between the French and French colonial forces versus the Viet Minh, which was the original form of the Viet Cong and later on the North Vietnamese army. They were known back then as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam as it would later be called. The French colonial troops used MP40s alongside more modern French and American submachine guns like the MAT 49 and World War II vintage Thompson submachine guns being supplied to the French. During the First Indochina War, the Viet Minh would capture hundreds, if not thousands, of MP40s from defeated French soldiers and French colonial troops. These would later be used against the American forces in the Second Vietnam War of 1963 to 1975. In 1954, the Soviet Union would also supply the refurbished MP40s to the newly formed state of North Vietnam. These MP40s were used extensively during the Vietnam War and were even supplied by the U.S. to the South Vietnamese armed forces. These MP40s were World War II captured MP40s captured by the American forces during the fighting in France and Belgium and Lower Germany, and were later refurbished and supplied to some South Vietnamese units, mostly as a policing weapon. There are photographs of both South Vietnamese armed forces and North Vietnamese soldiers armed with the World War II vintage German MP40. The MP40 was not the only World War II era German infantry weapon to be used. The old German Mauser 98K Karabiner Bolt-action carbine rifle was also used by the North Vietnamese forces during the war. These were originally captured by the French forces towards the end of World War II when the French army was reformed following the Normandy campaign in 1944. After World War II, the French army began issuing some German Mauser 98K carabiners to French colonial troops all over the French Empire that included Indochina and Vietnam. When the First Indochina War began in 1946, they began to refurbish more of these old World War II rifles, and they would end up being captured by the North Vietnamese Viet Minh or North Vietnamese forces at the end of the First Indochina War in 1954. Many of these Mauser 98Ks or carabiners were still in use during the Second Indochina War between North Vietnam and the United States. They were usually issued to Viet Cong forces, which was the guerrilla army or guerrilla wing of the North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, as they were also known as. And they were also captured by American and South Vietnamese forces. Some of the captured Mauser 98Ks were also issued to some irregular forces within the South Vietnamese military and militia groups fighting on behalf of South Vietnam. Another World War II era German infantry weapon was the Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, also known as the FG-42. This was a select-fire battle rifle issued to the German Fallschirmjäger, which was the German paratrooper divisions in the Second World War. Many of these were captured by American and British forces during the fighting in Italy and later the fighting in France and Belgium between 1943 and 1944 during the Second World War. After World War II, many of these were refurbished and were given to the French, who also used some of these during the Indochina War. During the Second Indochina War between the U.S. and North Vietnam, many FG-42s were also supplied by the Soviet Union to the North Vietnamese beginning in the 1950s, actually, before the Second Indochina War and just after the defeat of the French forces in the First Indochina War. Later on, when the Vietnam War went hot in the 1960s, the Soviet Union would supply more refurbished FG-42s to the North Vietnamese forces. Many of those FG-42s were captured by the American and South Vietnamese forces and were later issued to some South Vietnamese irregular forces, and some were also used by American Green Berets during the Vietnam War. They were considered some of the best of the outdated weapons used in that conflict, as the FG-42 was a pretty advanced weapon even for World War II and was still better than many of the rifles used in the Vietnam War. For example, the semi-automatic rifles like the SKS, and especially all the old bolt-action rifles being used, like the Mauser and German Mauser 98K, and was definitely better than the M1 Garand, than the American M1 Garand, or M1, M2, or M3 series of semi-automatic and select-fire pistol carbines. And then the final rifle that I could find from World War II that was still being used by the North Vietnamese was, strangely enough, the German Sturmgewehr 44, or the STG-44. This was a German assault rifle that was developed between 1942 and 1943, issued only in 1944 and 1945 at the very end of the Second World War. The Germans made anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million of these, and many of these were captured by both American and Soviet forces during the Allied invasion of Germany in 1944 and 1945. When the Indochina War began in 1946, many of these weapons were refurbished and a small number were given to the Viey Minh by the Soviet Union via China. Later on, during the Second Indochina War between North Vietnam and the U.S., the Soviet Union would continue to send Sturmgewehr 44s mixed in with AK-47s and SKS rifles. So these old World War II vintage assault rifles were now being used for the third time in the Second Indochina War, in the hands of mostly Viet Cong guerrilla forces, but in the hands of some North Vietnamese regular soldiers too. Many of these were also captured by U.S. and South Vietnamese armed forces, and they were also used by the Green Berets also. So the STG-44 saw some extensive use, even as far as the Vietnam War. There were also tons of German machine guns that were issued by the Soviets to North Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War. The first was the MG-34. And this was a German light machine gun from the 1930s. It was also used in World War II, and many of these were captured by the Soviets, American, and later on the French and British forces towards the end of World War II. During the First Indochina War, both the French and the North Vietnamese Viey Minh used the MG-34. The French were the first to use them as part of the infantry weapons issued to their colonial forces in Indochina. Many of these were captured by the North Viet Minh forces, and they began to use them towards the end of the First Indochina War. And they were still in use during the Second Indochina War. Later on, during the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War, The Soviet Union would supply even more of these old World War II vintage MG-34s, along with the MG-42 machine gun that was also used in the Second World War. By the end of the Vietnam War, there were literally hundreds to maybe even thousands of MG-34s and MG-42s being used by the North Vietnamese forces and by the South Vietnamese armed forces as captured weapons. Other World War II era German infantry weapons were also used. These included many handguns. Many of these were captured by the American forces and were supplied first to the South Vietnamese forces via the CIA. The CIA would supply outdated infantry weapons to both the South Vietnamese forces and other pro-US forces in Indochina. For example, in Thailand also. The CIA also supplied the South Vietnamese forces with German Walter P-38 pistols and some even older Mauser C-96 pistols. The North Vietnamese forces were already using the C-96 pistol even before the Indochina War of 1946 through 1954. Many C-96 broom-handle Mausers were imported from China during the Second World War, when the Vietnamese were fighting a guerrilla war against Japan. When the French came back to Vietnam in 1946, many of the local forces in Vietnam began manufacturing their own copies of the old Mauser C-96, while also smuggling more C-96 broom-handle pistols in from neighboring China. During the Second Vietnam War between the U.S. and North Vietnam, even more of these old C-96 broom-handle pistols were being purchased from the black market in China or being supplied by the Soviet Union as military aid. So these were some of the oldest handguns still in use during the Vietnam War, with the exception of old French and American revolvers that were also still in use in that conflict. But the strangest weapons to be used by the North Vietnamese forces are old German artillery systems, anti-aircraft guns, field artillery, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft artillery. And the first gun or artillery system on the list is the old German 20mm Flak 30. This was an anti-aircraft autocannon developed in the early 1930s, and it was the standard 20mm anti-aircraft machine gun used by the German forces in the Second World War. During the war, both the Soviets and pretty much all of the Allied powers captured thousands of these systems, and later on, during the First Indochina War, the French forces were the first to use the old 20mm in combat, again as cheap weapons being supplied to their colonial forces in Indochina and during the First Indochina War of 1946 through 1954. Later on, during the Second Indochina War, the Soviet Union also began supplying the North Vietnamese with old captured German 20mm Flak 30 anti-aircraft autocannons. They also supplied them with some of these guns before the war in the late 1950s, before the US got involved in the fighting in Vietnam, and only escalated sending these weapons later on in the mid-1960s. Another artillery system used by the Vietnamese was the old German Pak-40. The Pak-40 was a German 75mm anti-tank gun, a gun that was adopted towards the end of the 1930s and was the standard German medium anti-tank gun of the Second World War. At the end of World War II, the Allied powers had captured thousands of these German guns, and many of them were refurbished by the French. The French would use old Pak-40 anti-tank guns as both anti-tank guns and as light field artillery for their colonial troops in Indochina, and they were first used during the First Indochina War of 1946 to 1954. When the North Vietnamese won that conflict, they captured hundreds of old Pak-40 anti-tank guns. And later on, during the Second Indochina War or the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union began supplying them with even more of these Pak-40 anti-tank guns as military aid during the early part of that conflict. They were used as anti-tank weapons against American light armored vehicles and as field artillery because they were pretty cheap and pretty old, and the ammunition was pretty easy to refurbish. The Pak-40 was probably one of the stronger Vietnamese anti-tank weapons, with the exception of the Soviet-made 85 and 100mm anti-tank guns that were also being supplied to the North Vietnamese. And then the final artillery system that I could find, the final old German World War II vintage artillery system I could find still being used in the Vietnam War was the dreaded German 88mm flak, also known as the Flak 18, or sometimes the Flak 36 or the Flak 41, depending on the make and model. And this was the German 88mm anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun that was so devastating during the Second World War. Everyone knows that the 88mm was the most common anti-tank gun on almost all of the front lines involving the German forces in World War II. At the end of that conflict, the Allied powers had captured thousands of old 88mm flak artillery systems, and many of these were refurbished by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and given to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, starting in 1954. North Vietnamese had at least 100 of these guns in service between 1954 and about 1967. The guns were eventually withdrawn for service and were replaced with more modern Soviet anti-aircraft guns like the 100mm Soviet KS-19 anti-aircraft artillery gun. But for at least the first half of the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese actually used the old German World War II vintage 88mm flaks, and these were largely being used due to the fact that the Americans were using high-level bombers like the B-52. The B-52 flew so high that the Vietnamese did not have any anti-aircraft guns that could take it out. And this is before the North Vietnamese received anti-aircraft missiles like the S-75 Davina and S-125 Neva, which were anti-aircraft missiles from the Soviet Union, or in later China. So during the first few years of the Second Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese were using a combination of World War II vintage German 88mm flaks, Soviet 85mm anti-aircraft guns, and numerous 20 and 30mm and even 40mm anti-aircraft guns like the Swedish Bofors anti-aircraft artillery systems against the more advanced American jet-powered bomber aircraft being used in the skies of Vietnam. And so there you have it. These were some, if not all, of the German World War II era artillery systems and infantry weapons that were still being used as late as the Vietnam War. In fact, many of these weapons are still being used today on the modern battlefield. I have seen the MP40 and even the Sturmgewehr 44 and Karabiner 98K on the battlefields of Syria, Yemen, and even Afghanistan. So these old World War II weapons are really still in use to this very day, just not the artillery systems. So what do you all think of these weapons? Which ones were your favorite? Obviously mine is the 88, and if I had to pick an infantry weapon, it would be the FG-42, as that weapon was already rare in the Second World War. So what do you all think of these World War II weapons still being used in the Vietnam War? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was a J-Man Time, signing off.